are listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello and welcome to Awake in Relationship. My name is Silas Rose. I think it's fair to say that in the past year, COVID really has sucked all the oxygen out of the room, or at least the news cycle, and many of the other important issues that we're facing in our world right now have been sidelined. I'm thinking specifically about the climate crisis. Here in the Northwest, we just went through a really profound so-called once-in-a-100-year event, a heat wave that literally just scorched the earth. I really believe that this weather event has renewed a sense of urgency to take action, which is why I invited my friend Elizabeth Noble to come on the show and talk about what's happening out at Fairy Creek. For close to a year, blockaders on southern Vancouver Island have been putting their bodies on the line to protect a stand of rare and unprotected old-growth forests. Fairy Creek really is the latest salvo in a conflict that goes back decades in this province. Many people listening might remember events in Clayoquot Sound back in 1993, dubbed the War in the Woods, which is really Canada's premier event in terms of civil disobedience, I believe resulting in over 900 arrests to protect ancient forests on the west coast of Vancouver Island. This really gave birth to an international movement to end old-growth logging and highlighted the failed forestry policies and, dare I say, worldview that sees ancient forests and actually our relationship with the land as an endless resource for extraction and exploitation. There's a real sense, for me at least, of history repeating itself out at Fairy Creek. Back in the early 90s, I was really involved in forest campaigning, mostly in the Walbran and Carmana valleys. So this current conflict is definitely bringing up a little bit of PTSD, but also a kind of more nuanced conflict inside. Back in the spring, when the conflict was really starting to heat up, the three nations that control that territory, the Pachita, Dididat, and Hayoet nations, requested that all third parties leave the territory and not interfere in their internal business. So I've chosen to heed that request and not go out to the blockades. It is also important to note that land offenders are there really on the request of Elder Bill Jones and Hereditary Chief Victor Peter. There is so much in this conflict that warrants a deeper exploration, in particular indigenous land rights and title, which is really the molten core of many conflicts that are happening across Turtle Island. I hope to go into this topic in greater depth in future episodes. This conversation really is just kind of an entry overview with a personal friend, Elizabeth Noble, who's a campaign fundraiser at Sierra Club, BC. In this chat, we discuss the innate value of ancient forests for our health and well-being, but also to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. We also discuss solutions, specifically changing the paradigm of forestry from resource extraction to ecosystem health and respecting indigenous rights and title over the land. Enjoy. Elizabeth, good morning and welcome to Awake in Relationship.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah. So I approached you for this conversation for a couple of reasons, really. One, this is Fairy Creek in particular. The current War in the Woods is a very complex and emotional topic. Mm. I think it warrants a friendly overview, and I could think of no better person than you for that. Mostly because we share a similar path in the sense of spiritual community. And I think a similar, reasonably balanced view of change making. So a good place to start might be just kind of talking about the through line for you, at least individually, between your personal practice of meditation, mindfulness, and the work that you do. What do you see as the connection?
Yeah, thank you so much, Silas. That's a really good question. Having grown up in the Shambhala community, it's really difficult for me to sort of like assess what would be the separation, because my whole experience is framed by having grown up with Buddhist parents and mindfulness practice from a very, very young age. So it's, which comes first? It's hard to say, right? When your whole experience is based in that. So I think that the thing that drew me to this kind of work is the fact that I did grow up with the Buddhist teachings about interconnectedness and interdependence. And so, my mother, who is an incredibly sensitive, kind woman who would frequently feel devastated when she watched the news. She took these things very, very personally when she would see harm being done to others or to the natural world. And I kind of, internalized that really, really deeply as a young person. And, in many ways, it was actually quite paralyzing for me growing up, because I could see all the ways in which the world as it functions now is incredibly harmful. And so I felt a lot of guilt, wanting to be an artist, or actually not even having a choice. I for sure am an artist, but so many art supplies are incredibly toxic and damaging to the environment. And I felt incredible guilt about engaging in artistic practice, knowing that, for example, in art school, we were dumping liters of toxic dye into the St. Lawrence River untreated. And so I really, really struggled with knowing that climate change was real and feeling compelled to do something about it. Because that's also how I was brought up. You don't just, passively stand by. You really have to engage with the world. And so I've managed to find a balance where I'm able to do my artistic practice on the side and have fun and enjoy and connect deeply with that. And then I spend the rest of my time working on climate change, because for me, it is the defining context in which all other struggles are placed. And so it really feels like if I can find a way to work at this root problem and disentangle that a little bit, then I won't carry that same kind of frustration that I felt as a young person around, because I get meaning from doing this work.
Yeah, there's no enlightenment on a dead planet.
Exactly.
So you eventually found your way into the Sierra Club. I know you've worked in a number of other kind of NGOs and different capacities. Tell us a little bit about the Sierra Club, your work there, and what's the connection to ancient forests?
So I've been working as a fundraiser for about 20 years, and that's my primary responsibility at Sierra Club BC, is raising money as well. We are one of the oldest provincially scaled organizations, environmental organizations in the province. There's some other smaller groups in Vancouver that have been around for longer, but we really were kind of a pioneering group in the movement to protect land here in the province. And the story is actually quite funny, where somebody stole some letterhead from the American Sierra Club and just typed Western Canada below the logo and made a bunch of photocopies. And by the time, the American Sierra Club heard, the first campaign had already been won in their name. And so they made an exception. And we're one of the few Sierra Club BC and Sierra Club Canada are the only outside of the United States chapters. So we're technically a separate organization, but we share that name. This particular issue of forestry is the oldest and most complex environmental issue in the province. And, here we are in 2021. It's still happening. It hasn't been solved yet. And, today it has the added weight of understanding climate change and how climate impacts are affecting communities directly now. So that's a more nuanced understanding that we have today. And then the legal landscape is quite different today as well. And Sierra Club BC has come to understand that some of the approaches that our work took in the past were actually replicating the same types of colonial harm that were causing the extraction to take place in the first place. So yeah, we're still learning how to be a good ally and how to do this work in a good way. And we're understanding more today that you can't separate humans from nature. Like, that's really a colonial concept that is quite problematic. And so, in the past, for example, when Sierra Club BC advocated for the creation of parks are a colonial concept. And for many Indigenous communities, they were synonymous with the systematic and violent removal from their territory to create this safe space for white people, basically, to come and enjoy nature and recreate. It caused a lot of harm to those communities, and it caused a lot of harm to the land because it was suddenly cut off from these really sophisticated engineering practices that were designed to increase biodiversity. And as a result, both the people and the land were harmed when we created parks in the past. And so, it's an interesting and complex time to be working on this issue for sure.
Yeah, well, there definitely seems like there's an evolution in terms of how to approach preserving, ancient forests. And it's a history that goes way back. When I was cutting my teeth in the 90s in activism, I spent a lot of time in the Walbran and Carmata Valley. At that time, Clayoquot Sound was really blowing up. And we actually kind of resented the blockades there because they were stealing all our limelight. They got the cool title of War in the Woods. And so that might be interesting to explore just a bit of that history and some of the parallels to the current struggle at Fairy Creek.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't in BC at that time, so you actually probably have a more intimate knowledge of what was occurring. But, it was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. I think 900 people were arrested. It was a much more peaceful time. What's going down at Fairy Creek involves a lot of aggression. There wasn't the same kind of really intense tension. Like, obviously people were upset on both sides during the War in the Woods, but it feels different now in that regard. What's similar is that these movements aren't successful unless they generate a lot of media coverage. And so what happened with the War in the Woods is that international organizations were drawing attention. You had news crews from around the world. We've seen with Fairy Creek that celebrities have started to tweet about it. We saw Bryan Adams mention it, and Mark Ruffalo. And when that starts to happen, it really it changes things in a way. The real big difference, though, is the fact that there was almost complete consensus among the Indigenous people that they wanted to protect the forest during the War in the Woods. Clayoquot Sound wouldn't be what it is today if they hadn't stood up and wanted to protect their territory. And it's very different today at Fairy Creek, where you have an elected band council that is in favor of old growth logging, or at least they're in favor of exercising their own sovereignty as it exists under a colonial Indian Act band council system. For many years, the Pachidat did not get any compensation for the old growth logging that took place in their territory, and it's almost all gone, right? So this is like the last dregs, and I think in the industry they call it the guts and the feathers. So, while there's similarities in the sense that there's mass civil disobedience, the difference is that today it's a much more complex legal landscape. You have a provincial government that last year, maybe it was the year before, but relatively recently, signed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA. And so they've stated their intention to respect Indigenous rights and title. And the Band Council is very close. It's in its final stage of treaty negotiation with the Crown. Yet outside of that exists Indigenous law, which is a completely separate system of governance. And, each community has their own legal orders, which are just as complex in many ways as Canadian law. So there's an inherent conflict between the way that an traditional governance structure exists and Indigenous law. As a general rule, one of the top priorities is respecting the land. Mm. And the Indian Act Band Councils are a tool of colonial law. And most Canadian laws, in fact, especially when they pertain to the environment, Canada was a colony of Great Britain until 1982. And so all of our environmental laws are really designed for resource extraction. They are designed to get the resources out of Canada as quickly as possible, often in a raw form so that they can be processed elsewhere with cheap labor. So there's, an inherent conflict between the ways in which the Pachidat govern themselves.
Yeah, that for me really gets to the core of this issue, and for me, it's really been a sort of a soul searching, because I haven't gone out to the blockades for that very reason, that there's three nations that control that territory or have invested interest in that territory. Mm-hmm. Pichina, Diridat, and Hayuan. And they've actually requested that third parties, including land defenders, protesters, to leave the territory. So I haven't gone out. I've mostly chosen to stick to actions, in town and urban centers. Mm-hmm. What is your perspective on that request?
In many ways, it's a very legitimate request, for these people to exercise their own rights and authority. And yet, Indian Act created band councils are technically only responsible for what happens on the reserve. They're not actually responsible for what happens on the broader territory. And that was quite intentional when colonial law set up these reserves. And so, of course, they have a vested interest in what happens on their territory. And I believe all three of them hold revenue sharing agreements with forestry companies. If you look at it from an equity perspective, though, they're getting a pittance compared to what the province and compared to what the forestry companies are able to extract from their territories. And so it's not really what I would consider a fair situation. And if they're talking about having the choice to be able to determine their own future, I would regard the current situation that they're in as one in which they are not able to truly exercise their rights and title and make a choice, because the momentum and the legacy of the way in which resources have been extracted on their territories is such that it feels like that has to happen. And so until there is a genuine option available, which would not impoverish their community and would not rely on taking those resources out, I don't feel like it is a real choice that they're being given.
And I should mention for the audience that land defenders are there on request of Elder Bill Jones.
That's right. So I would consider Bill a friend of mine. I met him at an event here in Victoria that Sierra Club and the Wilderness Committee had organized to talk about the Walbran, because there is still a section of the central Walbran Valley that is unprotected. And almost every time I've been out to the Walbrand, Bill has been there to welcome me. And I visited Fairy Creek at his invitation on behalf of a group of people from Greater Victoria Acting Together, which Sierra Club and the Shambhala Center are members of. And Bill is a former logger who, grew up in some ways quite disconnected from the land, which I think you have to be to cut old growth. There has to be a kind of desensitization to occur to do that work. And at a certain point, he was laid off expecting to be able to come back because seasonal work like that often happens. And he was told he would not be called back for another 300 years because they had harvested too much at that point. And, he went through some of his own struggles, and you could probably find some clips where he shares his own personal story better than I can retell it on his behalf. But he is now acting as a story holder for his community, and he's sharing the traditional laws that he learned from elders in his community. And he's shared that Fairy Creek in particular is a sacred place where one would go to pray and meditate. And he firmly believes in the spiritual values of an old growth forest. And I think that if anyone does take the time to go out to an old growth forest that's intact like that at Fairy Creek and simply be quiet for a little bit, you will have that same experience. I certainly did.
And I hear that almost universally for people that have gone out there, is there's this kind of conversion moment, very emotional connection to those old trees that is really motivating people. And I certainly remember that from my time working in the Walbrand and Carmana.
It's hard to put a finger on that experience because Western society, prizes objectivity, and a spiritual experience is as subjective as you can get. Yet it's quite replicable. Almost anyone who goes out there and does spend time amongst these beings that are literally over 1,000-year-old, you really feel it. It's kind of a transformative experience where you have Bill inviting people to come visit. They come, they have this transformative moment, and then they really do want to answer that call to protect these places. The struggle for people like you who also want to be a good ally and who want to respect rights and title is that tension between wanting to respect that community to be able to determine its own future and also recognizing that these forests have inherent value. Personally, I believe should be protected at all costs.
Well, I think you've done a really good job in terms of articulating the complexity. It might be stating the obvious, but why is it so important to save these big trees?
Right now, current policy values forests for timber. That's timber and fiber. That's the one value that it's actually governed on. But apart from the spiritual experience that we spoke about, there are so many values that an old growth forest holds, from being critical habitat for endangered species like the marbled murrelet to holding water and soil on the land base, which mitigates the potential impacts of both droughts and floods. They sequester and store incredible amounts of carbon. You'll often hear loggers say, second growth forests sequester more carbon. And it's true that there is a younger age of trees in which the trees themselves are pulling in more carbon than some of the biggest, oldest trees. However, the majority of the carbon that's actually stored in an old growth forest is in the soil. And so when you disrupt that, the mycelial network decomposes and you just release a carbon bomb. And of course, second growth forests rely on having removed an old growth forest in the first place. So it's always a net negative. And then there's all of the other somewhat obvious things. There's traditional medicines, there's berries, there's mushrooms that could be foraged, there's recreational opportunities, there's tourism opportunities. Europeans love to come to British Columbia to see old growth trees because they have long since felled their old growth forests. There's unknown medicines that could come from trees. And in fact, I think almost every antiviral and antidepressant that is synthesized today comes from a compound that's found in forests. So we don't even know the next cure for cancer could exist in these forests. And I feel like you could make 1,000 different layers on a map and add all of the different values that exist. Traditional totem poles and cedar canoes require old growth forests. Yeah, woodpeckers that nest in the dying trees that require those little holes to crawl into. You won't find that in a younger forest. And when you're managing forests for like an 80 to 100-year rotation, you'll never, ever find that kind of decomposition, which is a critical component of any healthy ecosystem. You wouldn't think that a human population were healthy if everyone was the same age. You need elders and you need babies. And, so that the diversity that exists in an old growth forest is not replicable by human hands.
So let's turn our minds towards solutions. We talked a little bit about the failed policies that really go back decades in this province that essentially, pit workers against blockaders and put First Nations in this kind of impossible choice that we talked about, having to choose between preserving their territory and culture and a path of prosperity that's really available to every other citizen in this great land. The BC government has recently implemented legislation around UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is pretty radical on some level. How do you feel that this policy shift will change land use decision-making going forward?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will see some better decisions made if Indigenous people are genuinely given a better seat at the table, so to speak. But I think that unless we shift the paradigm and we actually start to manage our forests provincially as recommended by the Old Growth Strategic Review to legislate ecosystem health as an overarching all-sector priority, with timber being a value of one of many values that come from having a healthy, well-managed ecosystem, it's just shuffling the deck. And so maybe the Indigenous communities will get a bit more revenue from resources that are extracted on their territory. But if they're still forced to operate under the same paradigm, which requires an annual allowable cut of X amount that is higher than the forest can actually legitimately regenerate, then it's not really going to change anything. And so when the government did announce recently an intentions paper around how they would potentially break up tenure from some of the larger forestry companies and give more opportunity for Indigenous communities to manage their forests, which would be great. But if they're still operating under that same paradigm where we are only managing for forests for timber and fiber, it doesn't matter who is doing the logging. If it's all going to have to be done in a bad way, it's still going to be bad. So we have significant concerns about the order in which the government is going to choose to enact its own recommendations. And right now, what we are seeing is that the government is somewhat willing to engage with Indigenous communities when they make declarations, but they're more willing when those nations want to extract resources. It's like they'll prioritize resource extraction at all costs, minimize protection at all costs. And they're really only behind the decisions of Indigenous communities that are supportive of the existing rate of resource extraction. So we're not seeing the kind of shift that we would like yet from an ecological perspective.
The province also recently released a report on the future of old growth forests. What stood out in there for you?
It was actually the best thing that I've read from the government in a really long time. So last September, they released this report with a suite of recommendations. Two men, Al Gorley and Gary Merkel, went around the province and listened to people from all sides: forestry workers, forest industry, environmental groups like us, scientists. Got feedback from a number of stakeholders. And the report is excellent. It's called New Future for Old Forests. What stood out for me was that it did talk about this paradigm shift where it acknowledged attitudes around forests are changing in the contemporary society and within the context of climate change. We can no longer treat forests as just a crop, basically. When we give out licenses, they're called tree farm licenses. And so they really are treated like agriculture, and forests are so much more than that. And so to acknowledge that a forest is in fact an entire community of diverse beings that are completely interdependent with one another is a pretty radical thing to hear from a government report. I think the other thing that stood out for me was that it did call for exactly what Sierra Club BC and the other environmental movements, other environmental groups had been calling for, which was an immediate moratorium on all at-risk forests, so that we would have time to develop a plan, so that it would give communities like Pachidat, Dedidat, and Huayat the time to actually make a plan. Unfortunately, that's not what the government did in their response. And 6 months after the report was released, the three groups that we work really closely with issued a report card where we gave them a D and 4 Fs. We were actually really devastated because the current minister, Katrina Conroy, actually stated that there were no deadlines in the report, which made me wonder if she'd even read it, because that's so not true. There are milestones. There's a 6-month time frame, a 1-year time frame. They laid everything out for how long it should take to implement the report, but it's not currently happening. So that's disappointing.
Hence the critique, talk and log.
Exactly. Yeah. You've heard the expression, justice delayed is justice denied. And that is definitely the case right now. The high price of lumber has really put pressure to log as quickly as possible. And, forestry companies aren't stupid. They see the UNDRIP legislation here as a potential flag that things may happen differently. They see protesters. Again, it's an incentive for them to get in and extract as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And that will continue to happen if there are no changes made. The ground has been laid for this work to just continue.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for this overview. How can people find out more about the Sierra Club's campaigns and the work you do?
Thanks, Silas. Always nice to connect with you as well. And there are 2 really great ways to connect with Sierra Club BC. Our general website is sierraclub.bc.ca. And we also have a new engagement portal that is designed to reflect our new relational organizing strategy. And that's invitetoaction.ca, and that's TO, invitetoaction.ca. And there you can join one of our different communities. So we've devised a community for artists, for nurturers, for benefactors, for innovators. So we really do hope that individuals will bring their passion and their gifts to this challenge. We firmly believe that the way that we actually can build the kind of power that's necessary to change a very entrenched system is by bringing a different approach, by bringing joy, by bringing trickster thinking, creativity, and by elevating things that are already happening, because there really is so much already going on that's quite tremendous. And being able to share that as widely as possible, I think, is a key ingredient to being able to get the kind of change that we seek.
Yeah, it's a movement.
Exactly. Yeah. And we don't know what will be the one thing that kind of creates the sudden space for a shift to take place.
I want to thank Elizabeth again for this informative conversation. I know that we just skimmed the surface. It's a really emotional topic, and I really hope to go into it in further detail from different angles. If you want to learn more about her work or Sierra Club, head over to sierraclub.bc.ca, or you can check out the show notes at awakenrelationship.com, and I'll post some more information links about Fairy Creek there. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd really appreciate a quick review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe. So thanks again, dear listener, for tuning in. I hope this episode inspired you to connect with the big trees and do what you can to protect them. So till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.